Good afternoon and welcome to Policy Exchange. I'm Guy Newey. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the Environment and Energy unit here. This event is our second in our series of events under the theme Greener, Cheaper, which is how can we achieve environmental goals as cheaply as possible. And obviously this one is looking at the mysterious art or the science of behavioural economics. 30 years since Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky published Prospect Theory, Analysis of Decisions Under Risk in the journal Econometrica. And it's 9 years after Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for his work in this area. And I think most of us agree that behavioural economics is now incredibly modish and becoming more and more important to policymakers, both within the UK and outside. The shelves of right-thinking wonks are groaning under the weight of trendy titles, predictably irrational, nudge, blink, and nice to see that the father of it all, in lots of ways, Daniel Kahneman, is finally cashing in with his new book, Thinking Fast and Slow. A lot of behavioural research has looked at the issue of energy use and energy choices in particular, and including the issue of whether you how we can get people to take energy efficiency more seriously. Policy Exchange has done work in this area. We produced a report earlier this year called Energy IQ, which looked at how you can get people to make better choices in the commercial or businesses and organisations in the public sector to make better choices about how they use energy. The report got caught up in, I guess what we call now old-fashioned economics, the kind of confused carbon prices and problems of information. But we also found that obviously the best way of getting firms to take energy efficiency seriously is to get a chief executive or somebody on the board to take it seriously, and it filters the way down. The government's obviously tried this through the CRC, which we see as a very kind of clumsy instrument, and we think it would be much better replaced with a much clearer carbon price and, crucially, mandatory carbon reporting, which would create pressure from investors, from NGOs, from competitors, from think tanks, and from journalists to cut carbon, to create that kind of social norm of efficiency. Obviously, as lots of you know, that mandatory carbon reporting is now in consultation, and we really hope that it's not going to suffer from the deregulatory zeal which sometimes affects things in these areas. So this question of nudges and defaults and all the other terms that some of you will be familiar with is a very much a live policy area, both generally in all areas of public policy and specifically in energy. And we've got an outstanding panel of speakers today to discuss this. They'll speak in the order that I'll mention here. Hopefully everyone will speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll open out for questions, which I'm sure will be excellent. First speaker will be Danny Finkelstein, who, as well as being chairman of Policy Exchange, is perhaps even better known as a columnist and leader writer in the Times. He's had a career championing evidence-based research. His kind of compulsion to stamp down on any sloppy thinking is often seen on Twitter. This was my favourite example of Danny going against people who don't do proper evidence. Joey Barton, the QPR footballer and criminal, tweeted, violence always comes from zero self-worth. Danny was obviously infuriated by the lack of evidence of this assertion, tweeted back, actually studies show can come from too much unmerited self-esteem. As far as I know, Joey hasn't replied. I presume he's checking the literature just to see whether he can get that down in 140 characters. But Danny's been key in pushing this government for greater behavioural understanding in lots of policy areas. One of the developments from that was the setting up of the Behavioural Insights Unit, or the Nudge Unit, in the Cabinet Office, and we're delighted to welcome Owain Service, who's the Deputy Director there. He's had various roles across government, including in the Strategic Defence and Security Review. He was crucial in producing a report earlier this year called Behaviour Change and Energy Use, which I highly commend to those of you who are interested in this area. Looked at kind of options for how we can use behavioural understanding to improve energy outcomes. And it was, from kind of policy exchange's point of view, it's great to see kind of large-scale trials being promoted and used to test ideas. Our third panelist is Phil Bentley, who's Managing Director of British Gas. My understanding is after a brief flirtation with medicine, he took a degree in economics and then worked for BP for 15 years. And then after stints at Diageo and working with Guinness, he joined Centrica in 2000 and has been Managing Director since 2007. He's a huge rugby fan. He once said that the person he most admires in the world was Martin Johnson, which probably looked quite good in 2008. Doesn't look quite so good in 2011. And the final member of our panel is Matt Lambert, who's Director of Corporate Affairs and Citizenship at Microsoft UK. A career started at the Liberal Party, researching, pre-SDP merger, and he's had a long career in public affairs consultant before joining Microsoft in 1999. He's been kind of central to lots of the work Microsoft have been doing, both for issues such as raising the profile of issues such as volunteering and crucially for this discussion, efforts to improve environmental policy, environmental performance. So as I said, the panelists will speak for 5 minutes each, and then we will open it up for questions. But I'll ask Danny to speak first.
I've always rather claimed that Twitter is anti-Semitic because you're supposed to explain your entire opinion in 140 characters. It's very odd to find myself speaking at a conference on green energy, but you find yourself speaking at very odd events. I was recently told by my speaking agency that I was going to be booked to speak at the Christmas lunch of the British Promotional Merchandising Association. And then a week later, he said, unfortunately, I decided to hire a magician instead. I'm going to talk about a few things in the literature on behavioural economics, social psychology that can have an impact on the debate on green energy. And I want to start with the experiment on towels. In your hotel room, you will see a little sign that says, if you want to help the environment, you're going to put your towel back on the rack. But if you don't mind, you can drop it in the bath and it will be replaced. And all of us look at that and think, well, this is all about the hotel's cleaning bill, not about the environment at all, and we think this as we, of course, drop it in the bath. So a group of social psychologists began to do some tests on the Holiday Inn in Arizona to see whether the words on the card could change the rate at which people were prepared to put their hotel towels back on the rack. And they discovered that if they said, people staying in this hotel, 75% of them hang their hotel towels back on the rack during their stay. This would increase the proportion prepared to do it on any given night from 38% to 48%. And if they said 75% of people staying in your room will hang their hotel towels back on the rack, this would increase it from 38% to 58%. Because we're so anxious to gain knowledge about what other people like us are doing and to try to copy them. This is the reason why nobody in this room is wearing Speedos. Although I have said that, I have someone shout at the back, how do you know? Just a wild guess. But it does mean that if I said to everyone in this room about somebody, he looks like a geography teacher, you would all have an idea what I was talking about, despite the fact that, how can someone look like a geography teacher? Well, there are two reasons. The first is, if you become a geography teacher, you gradually start to look like other geography teachers in order not to stand out. The other reason is that if you already look like a geography teacher, you're more likely to become one. Now, this seems like an odd contention, but it is true that people who are called dentists are more likely to become dentists, according to a study of the American Dental Association, that people who are called Louise are more likely to move to Louisiana, and people called Florence are more likely to move to Florida. All of these are statistically significant, admittedly small, but statistically significant effects, and they're all down to social norms, to the idea that we try to copy what other people are doing. So when we, for example, say Britain has an epidemic of obesity, what we're actually doing is encouraging more obesity. when we think we're trying to tackle it. When we say the problem in our country is that everyone's throwing their rubbish, as Jeremy Paxman said, everyone is throwing their rubbish out of the car window, what people think is, oh, well, I didn't know everyone was doing it, it doesn't have to be like that. Robert Cialdini was doing a study of petrified wood in the Arizona forest, which had a sign that says, we're running out of petrified wood, please stop stealing it. People's reaction to that was, well, I better get mine quickly. People, in other words, do things that they are told are normal, and you can accidentally encourage the very behaviour you're trying to isolate. But you can also do something by creating social norms in the right direction and isolating the behaviour that you don't like. It will not work, as Tony Blair once did, to say all lawyers are member of the liberal chattering classes. What you will do then is tell all lawyers that to become a proper lawyer you need to be a member of the chattering classes and you need to be a member of the liberal elite. So it achieves the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. But you can tell people that all of their neighbours are saving on their electricity bill, that everybody in their road has decided to insulate their loft. And Robert Cialdini discovered on doing various experiments that not only was this a way of helping people to save electricity, but it was the only way, they discovered, that people would be persuaded that this liberal, that you work for the Liberal Party, so you all know, in by-elections, it's a two-horse race, it's a bandwagon. That's the reason why they use that. It's stronger than any argument, the fact that everyone else is doing it. There was actually a second part to this towels experiment. It involved experimenting between telling people that if they hang their towel back on the rack, the hotel will donate a small amount of money to an environmental cause, and telling them that the hotel had already donated money to an environmental cause, and they hoped that people would make a contribution themselves by hanging their towel back on the rack. It turned out, much against what everybody here might initially think, and certainly what I initially thought when I read that experiment, that it was the second of those that was more powerful. That people are much more inclined to reciprocate a gesture that you have already made, to try to pay back what you've already done. It's part of our basic essential sense of fairness. And so trying to use reciprocity to try to encourage green behaviour is also important. An experiment that's actually Daniel Kahneman, who was mentioned earlier, conducted was to fix a roulette wheel, roll a ball, and have it fixed to either go to 10 or 30 on the roulette, the ball to go to 10 or 30 on the roulette ball. The moment that somebody had done that, they were asked what the percentage was of African Americans in the United States of America. Their answer was strongly correlated to their roulette wheel experience. In other words, people take anchors and they begin to work from those anchors. Exactly why that works is still a matter of dispute. But it does mean that when you're trying to establish social norms, you have to be very careful that you don't establish an anchor lower than the one that you want to achieve, that you're not actually being too unambitious. And it's one of the reasons why in negotiations it does work to go first, because everyone else is then negotiating from the position that you started. Peter Shaw, the Labour politician, said in 1964, when he drafted Labour's election manifesto, he who drafts the first draft wins, because everyone's always working from the first draft, and there's an effect of that anchoring in almost everything. The final thing that we ought to consider is consistency and commitment. I always use this to describe the reasons why the coalition will last. If people are asked about university fraternity rituals, it appears that the more humiliating your university fraternity ritual was, the more you valued the membership of the university fraternity. Obviously, the Liberals have gone through an incredibly humiliating ritual to join a coalition, so they'll be the people that value it the most. The reason that you do this is to make sense of the sacrifice that you've made. It incidentally also suggests that if you can involve people in the programme of cuts that the government is doing, you can actually leverage that to help you win rather than help you lose. It may be that the reason why Margaret Thatcher was so successful politically was not despite the fact that the things that she did were very difficult, but because of it. Because once people had made that commitment, they wanted to assure themselves they'd done the right thing. So people, once they have begun to see themselves as greener, to see themselves as in favour of car safety, to commit themselves to being members of the coalition, will go a long way to then continue to commit themselves to it, and if you begin small, you can build up. So the idea of Michael Howard always used to say when someone accused him of doing something that was the thin end of the wedge, he would always go, "I'm against the thick end." And I was very impressed by that. I thought it was a great remark, but now I'm not so sure. Because I think the thin end of wedges is a very important thing. The reason that people think of it is that once you can get people going down a path, you begin to get them committed to it, and they can build up. So the fourth element, as well as anchoring, reciprocity, and social norms, is to start small and build up. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Owen Service. I'm Deputy Director of the Behavioural Insights team in the Cabinet Office, which is also known, as being said already, as the nudge unit, though we tend not to use that term to ourselves. It was set up in July 2010, and the basic remit of the team is to help to find new ways of encouraging and enabling people to make better decisions for themselves. In terms of the question that we face today, can behavioural economics help transform the UK's approach to energy? I think there's a fairly simple answer to this. It is that, yes, it can help to transform the UK's approach to energy, but it's really important to recognise that it's not the only solution. And I say that mainly because when people think about the government's current approach to nudge, they often suggest that in some ways the remit of my team is to think about nudging alone. And there was a recent House of Lords report which suggested that that might be the case. I always say, actually, no, it's not about nudging alone. It's about thinking of intelligent ways of applying some of the lessons that Danny outlined earlier to public policy in the UK, along with some of the more traditional levers that the government has at its disposal, whether it's aspects of regulation or the use of incentives. And very often we find that sometimes quite small interventions can have bigger effects than you might imagine if you were thinking about these things intuitively. So given that I've only got a few minutes to talk now, I thought I'd spend time discussing a couple of things. One, I thought I would just say a little bit about why I think behavioural economics is quite important in this area, and especially around explaining why people do not necessarily act in ways which might be considered to be financially rational to them in respect of energy efficiency measures. And then I thought I'd give a few examples of some of the kind of things that we're doing in this space. And as Guy was suggesting, this in particular relates to some of the work that we've been doing on domestic energy efficiency with the Department for Energy and Climate Change. So in terms of some of the behavioural factors that help to explain why people don't necessarily take action in relation to energy efficiency measures in their homes, I think there are 3 or 4 things which are quite important in this space. The first is that people have a tendency to, in the behavioural economics jargon, to discount the future. Individuals tend to prefer upfront rewards to rewards that are framed in the longer term, and that's the case even if the upfront rewards are smaller than those that they might get in the long term. And this creates a bit of a problem when it comes to energy efficiency, because all of the rewards that you get are very long term. They might be accrued over 3 or 4 year periods, but all of the costs are felt in the short term. You might have to pay a couple of £100 to get your loft insulated. And there is a bit of an imbalance there that makes it more difficult for people to overcome the barrier of introducing these measures in their homes. The second, one of the biggest factors, is that it's very often a hassle. If you want to get your loft insulated or cavity wall insulation for your home, I mean, frankly, it's just a bit of a faff. And in contrast to, say, doing up your kitchen, again, the rewards don't feel like they're as tangible as they might be in relation to equivalent measures. Thirdly, and I think Guy and Danny alluded to this, we talk often about defaults in the behavioural insights team, which is just another way of saying that people tend to go with the flow of the options that they have that are already set for them. And the typical example in this space is the temperature of your thermostat and what that's set at. People will typically go with the thermostat temperature that is set for them, or the hours that the temperature in an office building or a home is set to go off. And then lastly, I think we need to recognise more that it's not always easy for people to understand exactly why they should act and the benefits of acting to themselves. And quite often, and I think government has historically been guilty of this, we convey information in a way that's not always easy for people to understand. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that shortly. So just moving on to a few of the examples of work that the team has done. And I'm not suggesting that this is by any means kind of full assessment of government policy at the moment, more things that we've been actively involved in. We produced, as Guy said, a paper a few months ago on behaviour change and energy use, and there were a number of different policies that we enacted with the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and there was a real focus on testing and trialling new methods. So I think one of the things that we recognise is that the behavioural economics literature is quite rich and full of really interesting examples, some of them Dennis highlighted. But one of the things that we need to recognise is that it's very much context dependent. And many of the best examples come from US experiments and trials, whether they're in hotel rooms or very typically on the campuses of an MIT research lab. Many of the examples involve a professor experimenting on his or her students. And what we're trying to do is to say, there are some really interesting things here. How can we apply them to public policy in a UK context? And how can we learn from the different ways in which we might apply different methods so that we can develop policy which is more effective? So I just thought I'd give you a few examples of the kind of things that we're doing. The first is that with the Department for Energy and Climate Change, we're setting out a range of ways of testing different methods for encouraging people to insulate their homes. So a couple of examples, going back to some of the things that I was saying before. We are offering people upfront incentives in some areas and seeing if that will work better than, if you like, a subsidised scheme. So one example is a council tax holiday. Another is more of a group-based reward, which will point to some of the things that Danny was mentioning around social reciprocity and the power of social norms, and seeing what the relative effectiveness of those kind of upfront rewards might be and whether they can in some way overcome this tendency of individuals to discount the future. In other areas, we're testing the ability of us to overcome the hassle factor that's involved with insulating a home. So in one local authority area, we're working with B&Q to reframe the loft insulation process as a loft clearance and insulation process. So there are 4 or 5 of these trials that we're running, which are all outlined in the paper, which I won't go into any detail about now. And I can't, at the moment, tell you about some of the preliminary results. But what I can say is that some of them are looking to be very interesting indeed. So come back to me in a couple of months on that one. The paper also sets out some of the work and research we've been doing with CLG and the Department of Energy and Climate Change on energy performance certificates. And I thought I'd bring a visual display for this one. You're probably familiar with for those of you who can see, the current current way in which our energy performance certificates are set out. And it's quite a good example of how we're not always good at conveying information in a way that is powerful for individuals. So these are the 2 energy performance certificate graphs which show the current performance of your home against the potential. And from April next year, the first image that you will see on energy performance certificates will no longer be these graphs, but it will be a fairly sort of simple message which just says estimated energy bills for 3 years, £5,436 in this case, and then it just says, over 3 years you could save, and gives you 3 really simple ways of saving quite significant sums of money. So it makes it really clear why individuals might wish to act, and this is really important, a particularly salient moment in the life of a home buyer, namely the point at which they're likely to move in the first place. So that's another example. The third, again going to something that Danny was saying about social norms, is that there's a growing body of evidence, especially in the US, around the power of feeding back information to energy users. A company called O-Power in the US has been doing a series of tests for different messages and how they might be conveyed to individuals in a way that encourages them to reduce their energy consumption. And the key point that seems to be coming from this research is to always give somebody a kind of target that's realistic and realisable for them in terms of what they could be doing to reduce their energy consumption. And there are now 9 or 10 independent evaluations of this work that suggests that people who get this feedback can save about 4% on average of their energy use over the course of a year. So 4%, it's not going to completely solve all of the issues that we may have around climate change, but it's quite a significant, very low cost, interesting way in which this can be applied in the real world. And we're working with O-Power and a company called First Utility to test some of these insights in a UK context. So, as I say, I just thought it would be interesting to set out some of the practical applications of this in a UK energy context. I'd be happy to take any questions later.
Sorry.
Okay, well, thank you. I wasn't sure about Martin Johnson. I've forgotten I'd said that one, but great. Well, thank you for everyone for coming. It's nudging negawatts. It's not a subject I've spoken on before, but I think it'll become increasingly a phrase that trips off all our tongues. Negawatts, the opposite of a megawatt, an energy unit of energy saved. It's already used in California to financially incentivize and even value companies that are now delivering negawatts in the economy. Nudging, well, I'll probably miss the lectures on behavioural economics. I'll leave that to Danny, but also I turn to the learned organisation, the Office of Fair Trading, to get a good definition. Traditional models of markets have assumed that economic agents can be classed as Homo economicus rather than Homo sapiens. Homo economicus has infinite capacity to take in and process information, neutral to how things are presented, can anticipate, take into account the future, cares only about self-maximising and treats gains and losses as the same. However, Homo sapiens has limits to taking in information, is taken in by how things are presented, tends to be poor at anticipating the future, cares about other people and fairness, cares more about losses than gains. In short, Homo sapiens exhibits systematic biases in the way he views the world and markets. Now, I have a sort of simpler view of the world in a way, and it comes from my kids. Basically, my kids, my teenage kids, they blame me personally and generationally, not only for ruining the environment, creating global warming, not giving them enough pocket money, and of course melting the natural habitat of those cuddly polar bears. However, can I get them to turn their lights off at night when they go to bed, or switch off their computers? Absolutely no way. I think this is where nudge comes into it. How do we deliver that incentive to my kids, or said another way, maybe a metaphorical clip around the ear if those incentives don't work? So it's very timely. Why do we need nudge negawatts? I think climate change, whichever view you take, I think is here to stay as an issue. Why now? Well, rising prices make this an absolute economic imperative today. And then what do we need to do from the energy perspective? I think there's two simple things. I think we need transparency, and I think we need a joined up package. And let me just sort of take those in turn. And I'm not qualified to talk about the science of climate change, but I think I am, to start with, qualified, some would say too qualified, to talk about prices in the energy industry. And let's face it, energy bills are rising, even though, as I've tried to tell Jeremy Paxman, it's only 5% of your bill is after tax is supplier profit. Bills are rising not because of increased profiteering, but because the unit cost of energy is increasing. And there are the three factors that frankly energy supply companies don't control. Number one, they're rising because of increasing international demand for gas. They're rising because of the increased regulated cost to get energy to your home, and they're rising because of green levies. And I think we all recognise the investments that are required, the rising wholesale markets that we're dealing with, and I think that's why energy is becoming a commodity now which is expensive. We can't afford to waste, and that's where I think we come back to what we're trying to do in British Gas here, because we want our customers to understand what they're using, why they're using it, and also in terms of the energy efficiency side, the Negawatts side, for our customers, we want it to be easy and exciting to engage with. Now, often people say to me, why would an energy company be involved with trying to encourage its customers to consume less energy? But fundamentally, we think it's the right thing to do for a responsible energy company, and also we do service a huge number of homes, looking after half the homes in Britain engaging in energy advice. We're the #1 supplier of energy efficiency packages in the home today. And we were, until a couple of weeks ago, the largest installer of solar panels. Maybe more of that later. We're also the largest installer of smart meters. And despite what you might think, we actually insulate homes for free. You don't have to pay, we'll do the work. And we work with over 70 councils on council tax rebates. We've gone early on the Green Deal, and despite what the tabloids might say about trust in the industry, 50,000 of our engineers visit homes every day, and I can tell you now they're very much the trusted face of British Gas. So, in short, I'm proud to say I think we are one of the biggest nudgers of Negawatts in the country today, and it's something we'll continue to be actively engaged in. So what are we doing? Well, this month we announced 3 things that we under the umbrella of what we call the honest conversation. Firstly, and this goes to the point of confusion of choice, we are radically simplifying our tariffs. Customers and Homo sapiens hate the fact that they've got 544 different energy tariffs to choose from, and so we're offering 2 simple types, fixed and variable, and simple ways to pay, and that's it. Secondly, we are writing to all our customers to tell them that they could be on a better deal, and it goes back to the sort of greed and fear motivation of people. Customers hate it when they find they could have saved money, and we haven't told them. That's Homo sapiens for you. So something we're doing. And thirdly, from this month as well, we're putting on every bill a breakdown of what is in your bill, why it's changed, what's the cost of commodity, what's the cost of transport to your home, the cost of green. Because whilst it's right for Ofgem to call for fairness from energy suppliers, I think it's also right time now to have an honest conversation with government, debt, regulator, consumer groups about what is truly driving up energy prices. Now, another way of nudging, I think, is to ensure we've got smart meters in the home giving smart bills. Customers need to know exactly what energy are they using and when they're using it before they can truly engage in nudging Negawatts. The UK's current metering structure is over 50 years old. A dumb meter sitting under the cupboard in the hallway there is read on average twice a year. So if you're lucky, you'll get an accurate bill twice a year. Unlike smart meters that provide real-time, half-hourly time of use tariffs with displays to customers exactly based on their absolute consumption. And I think the ability to move from the, if you like, the cellar or the cupboard into the kitchen and on the smartphone, I think in terms of your energy consumption, is absolutely a key building block for nudging Negawatts. According to Energy Savings Trust, installation of smart meters can save over £100 a year off an average £1,200 bill. And we already know from being the largest installer of smart meters both in business and in domestic homes, we've installed about 80% of those here in the UK, that behaviour does change and it does make a difference. We've helped, for example, with the Home Office through monitoring and smart metering, a reduction of 17% of their energy consumption. And actually we're paid with an energy services contract for producing those savings and those megawatts. So I think we believe we want to go further with smart rollout. We call certainly for DEC to be clear about the transition to the DCC and the early rollout, not to roll back from the 2019 target for smart meters. We see it being absolutely an integral part of nudging megawatts. And the great thing as well is we're involved in a number of panels and trials working with the behavioural change unit. So the great thing about a scale business like British Gas is that we can do tests, we can see what works and see how how much impact we can have. For example, we've got a trial on the moment. 10,000 customers simply getting a bill insert. You use this much energy compared to your neighbours, which is always very interesting. You've used X% more, and if you'd done this, you would have saved Y. I think the thing we also do on our website is anybody can put in their postcode, and in similar housing, you can get, because we've got the scale that we have, you can get comparisons of bills in your area. And what we know is through behavioural change, we've seen on a trial over 5 years now, a 44% reduction in energy consumption. Another exciting trial we're involved in is home automation, taking control of your energy consumption through your smartphone. So anywhere around the world, you'll be able to turn on your heating, see what the temperature is, switch off your lights using smart plugs, understand the cost of the energy you're using. And again, we see that's quite important, using the home hub that talks to your appliances and talks to your central heating systems has been absolutely important. Again, in terms of the green deal, what should be in a package, we think there's the opportunities for smart homes and energy consumption, something that absolutely is coming to a street near you. It absolutely should be included as part of the green deal. So then, just finishing on the Green Deal, I think we absolutely support the flagship Green Deal policy. I think Nudge recognises there are financial barriers and behavioural barriers that are not always rational. We've already launched our Green Deal Go Early plan, where we fund it ourselves, and it's clear that there is interest there. But I do think we need incentives to get real scale, and it might be the thin end of the wedge, but I think once we start to get scale in it, I think we'll see bigger take-up. We certainly welcome the DEC announcement from Greg Barker recently about the £200 million of incentives. We're certainly keen to debate that with them in terms of how that best can be done. I think echoing Danny's towel analogy as well, we know that from our research, 61% of householders have said they would take action on energy efficiency if they could see it. And that goes to smart meters, but it also goes to things like solar panels, and it is a great shame that feed-in tariffs have changed in that regard, but also things like solid wall insulation. I spend a lot of time in housing estates across Britain, and certainly some of the post-war concrete-built, pebble-dashed homes with no insulation, no cavity walls or brick are very, very poor quality homes. What we've been doing is doing solid wall insulation, where you put a skin on the outside, and it completely transforms the appearance of these grey, dowdy estates, because customers can choose, do they want pink, do they want blue, do they want yellow, white, and it suddenly looks like Switzerland. And it is a great thing because it's visible. And the only thing where it really creates some real issues is those ex-tenants who had the right to buy and have bought their council estate can't do it. But it's really visible who's bought the home and who hasn't. So visibility, I think, is absolutely key, and I think we've got to really get that right in terms of what we want in the Green Deal package. And I think that sort of brings me to the final point, post-visibility. I think we also need joined up policies with government, regulator and industry. And I think that's something that we haven't always been particularly good at, because customers don't make a distinction between eco and cert and says, they just want to know, is it going to save me money? And I do think government's made good strides there. I think EPCs are good. I think that regulation around private landlords I think are good. But I still believe that integrating, ensuring energy company obligation for poorer households and harder to treat homes is seamlessly part of the Green Deal. It's not quite clear to us at the moment how eco fits in, certain CESP ends, and how it all fits into the Green Deal. So making sure that's joined up is absolutely key. The other one we call for is ensuring that we optimise the rollout of smart meters at the same time when the Green Deal is going on. There are some people who say we should separate completely the two, and we think one is absolutely the building block for behavioural change of the other. And so, for example, in terms of joined up thinking, or lack of, Ofgem are trying to restrict smart meter time of use tariffs. We think that's a bad idea. DEC have obviously reduced solar feed-in tariffs. We think that's a bad idea. We've got targets for delivery of certain CES, but not only the energy industry, but the insulators industry cannot deliver. We think that is, it needs joining up. And from an energy company point of view, we're placed on obligations and penalties, but we don't actually have incentives. And we think that needs to be joined up as well. I could go on. There are contradictions there, but I think with the right will and approach, I think nudging Negawatts is a huge opportunity for Britain, and I think we'll realise it. But we'll realise it when I think there's a recognition that energy suppliers, such as British Gas, are part of the solution, not the problem. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much to the Policy Exchange for inviting me to speak as well. My name is Matt Lambert, as you've heard. I'm the Director of Corporate Affairs and Citizenship at Microsoft. And what I'm going to try and do now is convince you of something counterintuitive, which is that IT is part of the solution and not part of the problem in this debate about nudging and encouraging people to do the right thing in the environment and reducing carbon footprints. But first, thinking about what Danny said, you've got to, I think, sometimes be careful what you wish for in terms of these nudges. And we use nudging quite a lot in terms of trying to do the right thing at Microsoft and trying to encourage our employees, get ourselves properly organised. And when I took over this role and the environmental responsibility in Microsoft about 4 years ago, we started to ask some questions about what are we doing things correctly within our own organisation. And sometimes, you discover things that you don't expect. For example, I don't tend to drive to work. I go on the train, and therefore I don't use the car park, a huge great car park under our headquarters in Reading. And what I didn't realise until one day we discoveed that the lights are blazing away in this car park 24/7, all through the weekend. There are lights out in the nice sort of park we have in Thames Valley Park on all the time. And just by sort of switching those off, we saved about £700,000 in the first year. I was able to be, for the first time, friends with the finance director who normally, shudders at the sight of the environmental sustainability guy coming through the door. And then I started to ask some other questions. Well, why don't we have these sort of light sensors switching off the lights? Most organisations you go to seem to have those. And you probably know these things from places where you work or other places you've been where suddenly the lights go off and you're sitting there and you've been relatively inactive, maybe pretending to work and following something on something on the internet you perhaps shouldn't be looking at, but suddenly the lights go off and you start having to wave your arms around looking for the sensor. And so we have these put in all the way through Microsoft. And I have a sort of bad habit of taking a copy usually of the Times, actually, Danny, into the loo with me, which I think is a peculiarly male thing to do. Some of you may know husbands or loved ones or whatever who do that terrible thing. But anyway, I tend to do that. And one night I'm working late in the office and I decided to go into the loo before I get on to the engagement I was doing that evening. The office is virtually empty, so I'm sitting there reading one of Danny's long articles, whether it was a reading column or something, and suddenly the lights go out on me. I'm sort of halfway through the operation, trousers around my knees, probably wearing a pair of speedos. So there's an enduring image for you of a Microsoft executive caught very much short, thanks to nudging. It doesn't always work out how you intended. let me say a few words, then what I want to really talk to you about is about what IT can do as an enabler and a nudger in this area. And I don't want to try not to sort of drag people into sort of jargon for IT, but I think many of you will have heard of the concept of cloud computing, you may already be very familiar with it. Cloud computing, in essence, is what you do when you don't hold all your data in servers in an organisation. You give it to someone like Microsoft, or there are other well-known suppliers of those the technologies available. You put all of it in the so-called cloud, but basically what you do is you outsource all your information, so most of it's in a data server, and you access what you need from the internet. And that has the most extraordinary potential to transform the role of IT in this environmental debate. So whereas typically IT has been seen as a problem alongside the airline industry, typically IT, some people have said, is responsible for something like 2% of global emissions. We think there's a climate group's Smart 2020 report that you could actually reduce the overall global emissions for everything by 15% just by using cloud computing right across the board. So the potential to make a change is absolutely enormous. And then if you take it down to specifics, there's another piece of research that says that something like 90% of carbon use for a small company could also be reduced by using cloud computing. And I'm aware, Danny actually, I think it was only yesterday, writing that people struggle to understand what a negawatt is or a megawatt is, or the difference between a million and a trillion. And despite having worked in the technology industry, not being an engineer by training, I too sort of struggle to understand what that looks like. But one of the pieces of research shows that you could reduce 1.5 million tonnes of CO2 in the UK, France, Germany and Sweden by using cloud computing. And I find an easier way to understand it if you say that you just take 500,000 cars off the roads by doing that. And that's, a huge amount of carbon taken out of the system, just by encouraging people to use a different type of technology in their computing. They won't see any change to what they're getting except an improvement, and by doing so, they almost tacitly help the environment by a huge amount. So, and then each of us could make that step and make a change. I'm not here to sell you PCs, but it is a fact that if you're using a Windows machine and you're using something older than Windows 7, and then you move to Windows 7, then you immediately make a 30% reduction in the use of carbon with your own PC. And you can go and measure that if you're interested. You can go and have a look on the Microsoft.com site, look for /environment, and there's a tool there which will enable you to work out with your own computer that you're using today, whatever it is, what the energy saving is now, what the energy use is now, and what the energy saving could be. So you can check that for yourselves. And there are other things that we can do. Typically, most organisations are using a huge amount of server power, pouring carbon emissions into the environment by using them. But actually, those servers are typically only using something like 15% of their capability at any one time. So you might have multiple servers, but any one of them is only using 15% of its savings. So just by getting the IT department to work more efficiently, you can maximise your use in a single server and take a whole load of those other servers out of the system, and thereby, again, hugely reduce the amount of carbon that IT is contributing. So I just want to say just a couple of things. There's some incentives or some disincentives and barriers which the government could remove, and Owen may want to take us back to the ranch, but there's a few things that really are a problem here. With the data centres, they are seen as part of the problem by the government. With the carbon reduction commitments, if you are providing data services in huge data centres, you are going to be suffering under the carbon reduction commitments. And for me, that doesn't make any sense, because if the data centres are reducing everybody else's carbon, the organisations that are providing them are being punished. There's a huge disincentive for them to do that. And we already know that many of these data centre suppliers are just basically not coming to the UK because of that system. They're taking their business elsewhere. That's bad for Britain, it's bad for the environment, and I really think the government needs to look at that again. And then the other thing that I think is a big mistake is that if you try to use green energy, renewable energy, to drive those data centres, you don't get any credit for it. There's no benefit to the organisation for doing that. You're still suffering. So Microsoft, for example, frankly found it difficult to put its data centres here in the UK under the current regime, and that's the same for any other organisation supplying those. And then I think if you take that down to individual organisations, maybe the organisations that you work for, there's very few incentives to use IT in a positive way. And one of the things which is the problem is that ICC just does not fit into the Green Deal. So if you think about the various technologies which get tax incentives for various technologies that do get tax incentives, ICT is not one of those. And again, I think the government was making a mistake. It recognised that ICT could be an enabler and not just part of the problem, and gave part of those ECA scheme tax allowances to encourage people to use them more efficiently. You could make a huge nudge in the direction of encouraging people and organisations to use ICT more efficiently. And then finally, I think the government as an exemplar could do more. And we're working with the government already, and I hope they will embrace this right across government to take up the sort of anywhere working thing, which is about flexible working and about encouraging people not to travel so much, to use technology more efficiently to avoid travel and other uses of transport and so forth, which would damage the environment. To use online meetings, to save money while doing so. In doing that, again, it's a tremendous nudge towards doing the right thing about the environment. So, that's my point of view on this. I think we're missing a huge opportunity to take a huge amount of carbon out of the system on a global basis. Here in the UK, there are many, many disincentives to using technology, using data centres, building cloud computing right across the board, and really making a huge difference to the environment. I do think the government needs to think again. So, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much to all our panellists. We covered a huge amount there. Smart meters, Green Deal, the dangers of motion sensors in toilets. I'm going to open up to questions now. I'm going to try and create a social norm, i.e. the shorter the question, the better. You'll get some appreciation. So there should be some microphones coming around. Please introduce yourself. Who is anyone first up?
That's not a social norm. What you meant to say was that everybody always asks very short questions.
Right. Now I've terrified everyone of avoiding asking any questions. The gentleman just there.
Steve Portmore, Transform Capital Management. I'm just interested in people's view around incentives in other countries, such as tax placed on plastic bottles and bottles in Germany, where the renewal or the recycle rates many times higher than in the United Kingdom. We used to do this many years ago.
Not true, sorry.
Is that not?
No, it's not true.
I understood it was up to 80-90%.
Not true. Yes, 20% of that goes into blast furnaces to reduce emissions.
Okay.
So my basic question is taking best practice from other countries and implementing those solutions in the UK where they make most sense. How can we do that in the fastest way? Because we drag our feet a great deal.
Okay, I'm reluctant to take questions about tax incentives because it's kind of beyond nudges, I would suggest. But
there is an interesting nudge element to the whole question of whether you pay people to do things. And Dan Ariely's famous experiment about the Israeli kindergarten, some people may be familiar with. What they did was they were fed up with people being late. So what they did was to say, if you are late, we're going to fine you £20. The result of that was that more people were late because they thought, well, we'll pay the £20. The social embarrassment had been removed. Now, you can, of course, make people behave differently through tax incentives, but you have to be very careful using any financial incentive that it doesn't destroy people's sense of social involvement in what you're doing. So it can also have a work perversely.
I just want to build on that and just to give the example of insulation, because we give it away for free now, and we're still way off our target. So we have killed the commercial market for insulation, and we're still nowhere near there.
Why do you think that is?
There
Why
are
are
still
people
9 million
taking
homes in Britain with inadequate insulation. So how far do you go?
But I think going back to what I was saying earlier, one of the interesting things about the use of incentives is understanding how that incentive is applied and framed. So the kind of things that I was talking about before, in some ways they are an incentive. So a scheme that looks at clearing somebody's loft as well as insulating a loft is a form of incentive, but it's a different kind of incentive, a different way of looking at the way in which you deploy incentives.
Okay, good stuff. Next question. Chat just here at the front.
Cheers. Kevin from Keep Britain Tidy. Just intrigued around your thoughts on the role of education. Behaviour change comes from the changes in values and attitudes, which can take decades to change. Just your thoughts on education, really.
Anyone comment on?
I mean, we have a school program called Generation Green, which is linked to the national curriculum around the whole environmental debate and where energy comes from and what it costs and how much is, carbon is emitted. And so I think we do get that. And we found that when we ran a program called Green Streets, which was community-based programs, it was often by going into the schools, and the kids came back to the parents and said, "Well, what are we doing, Mum?" And I think there's a lot that we can all do together.
Some of it is in danger of trying to persuade my 9-year-old that he doesn't want to set up a coal-fired power station, and I do think some of the and some of it's also. Well, there was a Sooty and Sweet record when I was a kid in which Sooty was attempting to plane down a tree to make a cocktail stick. And quite a lot of what people are taught in schools about the environment seems to me to add up to that. Whereas Keep Britain Tidy, on the other hand, might actually make a real difference. Provided we do one thing, which is don't teach people that Britain's becoming untidy, because it'll make Britain more untidy. If we teach people that we're actually succeeding in making people not do these things, you might succeed in making them do it less.
Matt, do you want to talk? Microsoft have obviously had some experience trying to teach people within their own organisation about energy use. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, I was thinking so much about Microsoft, and I don't think it's the problem with the bigger companies, because they're having to think about this anyway, partly because not so much of a nudge, they're being forced to by the government. But if you mean education in a broader sense, I mean, one thing we do know is there's been some research, small businesses, something like 60% of them do not know what they could be doing and what the incentives are that are available to them. So there could be a role for the government in terms of educating those small businesses, maybe for the CBI and the small business federations, to get out to those small business managers, let them know what is available. Clearly, there's strong evidence that they don't understand that.
Okay. Anyone else? Any other questions?
So John from Cambridge Econometrics. I obviously come from an orthodox field source. I'm very interested in these ideas about behaviour change, because that is in fact a key weakness of mainstream and orthodox economics. What I'd like to ask is, these policies for encouraging behaviour change, some of them are looking at a more community aspect, while increasingly in Western societies people are becoming more individualistic. So how do you marry, if you like, the thrust towards only I count with policies to encourage behaviour change, which try to make people think they are in some sort of society? After all, we know there's no society, as I said a few years back.
I mean, I'll make 2 points. One of the things about the thrust of the sort of the traditional economists' counter-attack to behavioural economics is that it doesn't really amount to anything. It's very marginal. The effects we're talking about are very marginal. But in fact, they ask really big questions like, is the stock market just a big illusion in which it consists of a load of people illusory thinking that all the things that they're predicting have not already been priced in, and being overconfident they know more than the price, and therefore not actually making any money when you look over a 10-year period. So they're really quite big questions that are posed by understanding the limitations of human beings and understanding their overconfidence that explain a lot about economics. In terms of groups, I think that behavioural economics, what we understand now more about people's behaviour, explains actually that the people don't. There is such a thing as society. I mean, that basically is what it explains. It explains what is otherwise inexplicable, which is why do we cooperate with people who don't share our genes? And the answer is because we think they're going to cooperate with them. The towel effect, the whole of social norms, is based on the idea that you need to make sure that you only cooperate with someone who's going to reciprocate your favour. And in order to identify the person who's going to reciprocate your favour, you use a shortcut. That is that person is like you. And therefore you go to war with everyone who's not like you and cooperate with those people in a small gang who are like you. So the answer is that behavioural economics suggests that reciprocity is at the heart of people's idea of fairness, and therefore at the heart of the creation of communities. There's an awful lot that behavioural economics can teach us precisely in seeing human beings, in correctly seeing human beings as not merely about themselves, but both as families and as communities of people who reciprocate favours.
Phil, do you see examples of this in some of the work you've been doing in communities and trying to get a community scale incentives going?
Yeah, and actually, we've done both. We did what we call green streets, which were individual homes and then we did a Green Streets too, which were community-based schemes. And what I would say, one of the learnings was that the community-based schemes obviously engage far more people, and they understood what it was delivering for the community, because often it was, whether it was solar panels for the church hall, or whether it's something in the scout hut, or something that they could all feel they could benefit in. So I think I wouldn't underestimate the power of the community still today in Britain. I think the other thing is, it's back to almost a street by street. If you can see it's coming to a street near you, then I think you're more likely to get engaged and behind it. And certainly we've seen some big programs. We have one in Tredegar where we were installing huge numbers of solar panels on housing estates and on training up people to do the work, because this was third generation unemployment after the mines closed in the 50s. Mm-hmm. And once we got real interest in the community, it's become huge. And there's a community now that has now sort of they created their own company on the back of it, and now they go out into other communities to say, well, this is what we did in Tredegar, this is what you could be doing. And people are absolutely passionate about this stuff. So I would, if you want something, if you ever want to see examples of it working in action, I could point in the right place.
And Phil, does the Green Deal, as it's currently designed, take advantage of that kind of momentum?
I think that's where the eco comes in, which is targeted on the harder to treat, social housing. I think that's why it just needs to be joined up. Our problem has been that, frankly, government sets targets and then they set sub-targets, and by the time it gets more and more difficult for us to meet the general, big picture approach, which is, I think, to your point earlier, is, if it saves energy, if it looks like it saves energy, it does save energy. It saves energy. It's a good thing. And I think sometimes we try and put too many restrictions on it. They're not helpful.
Yeah. All right. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it is about community, it's about what we might call social norms, it's about the tendency that humans have to feel like they want to fit in. I think one of the interesting things that comes out of some of the behavioural economics literature is that very often people don't know what other people are doing. The petrified wood example is a good one. The example around giving people feedback about what their neighbours are doing on energy consumption is another. It's not just about tapping into social norms and the community aspect. There are important individual aspects to the use of behavioural insights too. So some of the stuff around the use of defaults for pension enrolment or organ donation are as much about the choices that an individual faces as that social aspect.
And do you think there's been a reluctance in the past to take advantage of, you go back to the 2006 energy bill, if my memory is correct, this comparative billing was looked at, was considered, but the decision was they did some polling and people didn't like the idea of being told what their neighbours were consuming, for obvious reasons, because
no one ever thinks that the cognitive illusions were something that they did or will work on them. It's one of the, if you ask somebody whether or not if a member of the Hare Krishna sect pressed a flower upon them at an airport, they would be more likely to give to the sect. They would tell you, I'd be less likely to give to the sect because it's really annoying when they press the flower on you. But when you actually do the experiment, you find they almost all give. Because it's a natural human reaction. So you can't, if you ask people what they think the effect of it, and in fact sometimes when you tell them the results of the experiment, they still don't believe it. One of the things, you mentioned Daniel Kahneman's book, his book is full of examples of him doing a test, for example, testing whether or not, they tested the aptitude of a number of Israeli army officers in order to see whether they would be good as officers, these were officer candidates. That they were aware that there was zero correlation between literally 0.1 correlation between what they suggested would happen and what actually happened, but they still went on doing it, even though they knew it.
I'll take a question. Actually, I'll take a couple. I'll take one down here and then a gentleman over there.
Thanks. Jennifer Holroyd. This question, I think, probably for Danny and Owen. What do you think would be the main challenges for the government in pushing forward this sort of agenda, given it might be seen as a sort of nanny state in disguise or something like that?
It's a connected question. John Burden, Northern Power Grid. We're talking today about megawatts, but the other part of the equation that's very important for the future of energy supply is moving the time when people use their energy through time of use tariffs and any other sorts of means. For Owen, actually, has the Cabinet Office been doing any work in this area, and any other comments that the other panel members might have?
Okay, Owen, do you want to start on those two?
The question on nanny state. I mean, I think what's important in this agenda is to recognise that the principle behind economics is to give people choices. So there is no nanny statism about that, to my mind, in the sense that nobody is telling somebody what to do or forcing them down a particular path. And very often, the way in which we work is to seek to find ways of encouraging people to do things which might go with the grain of their underlying motivations. So I don't see it as being nanny-statism, I see it as being almost the opposite of that. In terms of areas that the Cabinet Office is interested in working in, I mean, the Cabinet Office obviously has a general interest in potentially any aspect of government policy. Time of use tariffs isn't something that I've particularly been engaged with. The project that I mentioned really referred back to quite a specific piece of work. But I do think the areas are an interesting one for exploration.
I mean, the idea behind time of use tariff is that now you can get a half-hourly read, and you've got a meter that's connected into the kitchen or onto your smartphone and back to our billing system. We know that peak electricity is hugely more expensive, and actually we need to build more peaking plant, but if we move to nuclear and intermittent wind, we're going to have a lot of peak that we don't frankly need. Now, if we not only, if we can shift demand so we don't need to build as many power stations in the long run, that's a good thing. So time of use tariff, if I can persuade you that I've got 10p off, after 10 o'clock, you might put your dishwasher on at that time. Now, my point was that just today, RMR, Retail Market Review from Ofgem, they're saying you can't have an evergreen time of use tariff. We think that's a bad move. So, I think there's got to be something, back to my point about joined up. The other piece about the power networks, and I absolutely agree, there's a huge amount of investment needed to rewire our grids that are designed to move from great big power stations in one direction to the home. And now we're going to have distributed generation, moving it out in two directions. We are the largest installer of electric charging points for electric vehicles. And if we put 10 in a street, you'll know this better than me, John, you have to reinforce the grid. It's just not designed for it. Now, that goes to my earlier point, which is there's a huge investment needed. We don't actually know what the impact will be. We are in a pilot on this, but we've got to get real about what the cost is, because this is going to drive up the cost of getting it to your home. Now, that's not something I control, but that's part of the honest conversation, and some transparency around what's really needed, I think would be very welcome.
Do you want to talk about nanny statism? Sorry,
just a few things. There are a few things you can do in the technology space here, because very typically what people do will tend to leave their computer on overnight, walk out of the office and leave it running. And you can centralise that control of that, so you can power down all the computers that are not being used automatically. The savings there could be tremendous.
I mean, on the question nanny state, a lot of the time it just consists of putting the word nanny in front of state. And not much more than that. There's a question if the state, there's lots of things we agree the state should do. The question is, how does it do them? So, for example, if you're going to collect tax, does it make sense to ask people loads of questions about their income, and at the end ask them to sign to say what they've said is true, when you know that by that time they've committed themselves to the statements by writing them down, and the signature and signing would be no difference? Or should you put the signature at the beginning, saying that you're going to tell the truth on that form, and once people are committed to it, they'll pay more, which we know works, and it's just a different way of doing the same thing. There are lots of examples of that, where you can make the state work better. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of the Nudge book was the beginning example where he talked about pricing goods in the canteen, and where you put the goods affected what people would order. And you had to put the goods somewhere. So you were going to take a decision somehow, and the government takes lots of views about behaviour it does and doesn't like. It doesn't want people to claim benefit fraudulently. It wants disabled people to go back to work if they can, as soon as they can. It's keen that children who go to school will learn more. Unless you take once it ended up in an argument in the Institute of Economic Affairs, in which it became apparent they didn't believe in compulsory education. And then the conversation then ended at that point because there's no further to take it. Once you take the view that that's not the view that we take of the state, that we think there are limited but still significant functions the state must take on, then I think it's right to think how you interact with people who use those services and do that in an intelligent way.
Okay, I'll take a question just there.
Jim Shew formerly from Ceres Power, which is a commercial partner of British Gas. It's developing fuel cell microgeneration
Speak up a bit. That'd be nice.
Sorry. Developing a fuel cell microgeneration boiler, Ceres Power. The question actually is related to the comment about installation of solar panels. I wonder if you could expand on that further, so you might have something to say on it. Might it be related to Carillion and their announcement today? Also, on the general subject of Nudge, could you perhaps say something about the association of British Gas with boilers and meters, and whether that's related to you being the largest meter or smart meter installed these days?
Okay, do you want to take the first one? I just didn't quite get the second
question.
question.
Quite specific question. I'm happy to take it offline. I mean, the solar panels, just simply that they halved the feed-in tariff rate a couple of weeks ago, and therefore overnight the incentives to install solar panels disappeared. We had some large deals lined up with local authorities, big contracts to put solar panels across huge housing estates, and overnight the economics. Try and put 200,000 solar panels up between now and the 11th of December. I have to take the meter point offline. I mean, we just think smart meters are, an opening to bringing energy from under in the cellar and into the kitchen and onto your smartphone, and we think that's the best way to engage with energy. And smart meters are part of it. My issue is Ofgem don't recognise that there is a time of use tariff that can incentivise behaviour that they refuse to allow, potentially would refuse to permit in the new rules that they are contemplating.
Okay.
I have one last on Nudge, which was I went to the drinks industry, just to prove that I'm actually behind it. If you put a jar of lemons on a bar, the sales of gin doubles. So little things like that.
Well, I'm sorry, but we're out of time on that lemon anecdote. I'd just like you all to thank our panel, and thank you all for coming.